Sometimes the people who save your life are the ones who were already falling apart themselves. Rain hammered against the glass walls of the Sterling Grand Hotel as black luxury cars lined the curb beneath the glowing Manhattan skyline. Inside the ballroom, Vivian Sterling stood frozen beneath a chandelier worth more than most people's homes, her diamond earrings catching the golden light while whispers followed her like ghosts. Billionaire, CEO, Ice Queen, the woman who inherited a $10 billion empire at 34. But none of them knew her hands were trembling beneath the table. None of them knew she hadn't slept in 3 nights. Across the room, board members smiled with fake sympathy, while reporters waited outside like vultures after the public collapse of her engagement to Marcus Hale, the man who had nearly destroyed both her company and her trust in humanity. Vivian stared at the champagne in her hand without drinking it. The music sounded distant. The laughter sounded fake. Everything sounded fake now. "Miss Sterling," a waiter asked softly, "are you all right?" Vivian blinked slowly before forcing a smile that looked painful even to herself. "I just need air." She walked through the crowd without looking at anyone, her silver gown brushing against polished marble floors as flashes from cameras exploded outside the entrance. The cold New York rain hit her skin the moment she stepped out onto the side street beside the hotel. Finally, silence. Or at least something close to it. She wrapped her arms around herself and kept walking without direction, heels splashing through puddles while thunder rolled over the city. Somewhere deep inside, she felt completely numb. Not sad, not angry, just tired. Tired of betrayal. Tired of pretending she was strong enough to carry a world that never loved her back. Half a block away, Ethan Cole pulled his old Ford pickup beside a convenience store while his 7-year-old daughter Lily slept against the passenger window in her pink winter coat. Her small hand still held the stuffed rabbit she carried everywhere. Ethan smiled faintly and adjusted the heat vent toward her before glancing at the clock on the dashboard. 11:42 p.m. Another double shift finished. Another night trying to keep life together with duct tape and determination. He rubbed exhaustion from his eyes, then noticed movement across the rain-soaked street. A woman in an expensive gown walking alone at midnight in weather like this. Behind her, a black SUV rolled slowly around the corner with its headlights off. Ethan frowned immediately. Something felt wrong. The SUV accelerated slightly. Vivian never noticed it. Her eyes remained fixed on the wet pavement beneath her feet, as if she were too lost inside her own thoughts to care what happened next. Ethan's firefighter instincts kicked in before his brain could argue. "Stay here, sweetheart," he whispered to Lily, pulling on his jacket. "Daddy will be right back." He stepped into the rain just as the SUV door suddenly opened. Everything happened fast after that. A shout, tires splashing through water, Vivian turning too late, Ethan lunging toward her without thinking. Then sharp sounds cracked through the storm like exploding glass. Vivian gasped as Ethan wrapped his arms around her and forced her down onto the pavement beside a parked car. The world spun violently. Rain poured over them. Somewhere nearby, Lily screamed from the truck. Ethan's face tightened in pain, but his arms never let go of Vivian. Not even for a second. She stared at him in shock, her breath shaking as red stained the shoulder of his gray jacket beneath the rain. "Why?" Her voice broke completely. "Why would you do that for me?" Ethan struggled to breathe evenly, water dripping from his dark hair into exhausted eyes that somehow still looked calm. He glanced at her for one quiet second and whispered, "Because you look like someone who stopped wanting to live." The white hospital lights blurred above Vivian Sterling as she sat motionless outside the emergency surgery room, with Ethan's blood still dried against her hands. Rainwater soaked the hem of her silver gown, but she did not notice anymore. Time had stopped somewhere between the sound of Lily screaming and the moment doctors rushed Ethan through those double doors. Across from her, the little girl sat curled into a chair, 3 sizes too big for her, clutching her stuffed rabbit against her chest with tiny trembling fingers. Every few minutes Lily looked toward the surgery room with wide, frightened eyes, as if expecting someone to tell her the world had ended. Vivian swallowed hard every time she saw it. She had spent years inside boardrooms negotiating billion-dollar deals without flinching once, yet now she could barely breathe. Because for the first time in a very long time, someone had gotten hurt protecting her. A nurse approached quietly with a blanket. "Miss Sterling, you should rest." Vivian shook her head immediately. No, her voice cracked softly. I am staying. The nurse hesitated before draping the blanket over Lily instead. The little girl whispered a tiny thank you without looking up. Vivian stared at her for a moment before slowly kneeling beside her chair. Lily, the child finally lifted her eyes. They were red from crying. Is my daddy going to heaven too? The question hit Vivian harder than anything else that night. She froze completely. She had no answer prepared for something that honest. Something that small and heartbreaking. Vivian glanced toward the surgery doors again before forcing herself to speak gently. No, your daddy is very strong. Lily looked down at the stuffed rabbit in her lap. My mommy was strong too. Silence filled the hallway after that. Heavy, painfully human. Vivian sat beside her instead of replying because suddenly she understood this little girl more than she wanted to. Loss had a way of making people older than they should be. 2 hours later, a doctor finally stepped out, exhaustion visible beneath his eyes. Vivian rose instantly. How is he? The doctor removed his mask slowly. He is stable. The injuries were serious, but he is going to recover. Vivian closed her eyes for one brief second as relief nearly buckled her knees. Beside her, Lily burst into tears and hugged the nearest thing she could reach. Vivian. Instinctively, Vivian wrapped her arms around the little girl and held her tightly while Lily cried against her shoulder. It felt strange, warm, real, like something inside Vivian's chest had cracked open after being frozen for years. Early the next morning, Manhattan looked pale and exhausted beneath gray winter clouds. Vivian stood alone inside Ethan's hospital room while machines hummed softly around them. Without the chaos of the storm, he looked different somehow. Younger. Tired in a way expensive suits and polished billionaires never looked tired. His hands were rough with old scars across the knuckles. His wedding ring was gone, but a faint mark remained on his finger. Beside the hospital bed sat a worn backpack with Lily's drawings sticking halfway out of the zipper. Vivian carefully pulled one free. A crayon drawing showed 3 people holding hands beneath a crooked yellow sun. One stick figure had angel wings. Mommy, Daddy, Lily. Vivian stared at it for a long moment before setting it back exactly where she found it. Ethan shifted slightly in bed with a quiet groan. Vivian immediately moved closer. His eyes slowly opened, unfocused at first, until they found her standing beside him. You are awake, she whispered. Ethan blinked once, clearly disoriented. Lily, she is safe. His entire body relaxed at those words. Not relief for himself, relief for his daughter. Vivian noticed that immediately. Ethan winced slightly as he tried to sit up. Do not move, Vivian said softly. The doctor said you need rest. Ethan studied her face for a quiet second before giving a faint, tired smile. Guess I ruined your dress. Vivian looked down at the dried blood staining the silver fabric. For the first time in months, something almost like a laugh escaped her throat. Small, fragile, human. I think it needed a better memory anyway. 3 days later, snow drifted softly across Manhattan as Vivian stood outside a small neighborhood grocery store on the Lower East Side, holding 2 paper bags she had absolutely no idea how to carry properly. The billionaire owner of Sterling Dynamics had negotiated mergers worth billions of dollars. Yet somehow she had just spent 15 minutes arguing with a self-checkout machine over pancake syrup. Inside Ethan's apartment upstairs, Lily sat cross-legged on the living room rug coloring carefully while old jazz music played quietly from a radio. Near the kitchen window, the apartment was small enough that Vivian could hear the kettle beginning to whistle from across the room. Small enough that nothing felt hidden. The walls carried tiny scratches from years of real living. Family photos crowded the shelves beside secondhand books and mismatched coffee mugs. One picture in particular kept pulling Vivian's attention. Ethan stood smiling beside a woman with warm brown eyes, while a toddler Lily sat on his shoulders laughing at the camera. There was no luxury, no polished perfection, just happiness. Real happiness. Ethan slowly entered the kitchen wearing gray sweatpants and an old thermal shirt, one hand still resting against his healing shoulder. You should not be carrying groceries, Vivian said immediately. Ethan gave her a tired smile. And you should not be buying $30 worth of organic strawberries. Vivian glanced down at the grocery bags defensively. The label said they were imported. Ethan laughed quietly under his breath for the first time since leaving the hospital. The sound caught Vivian off guard. It changed his whole face somehow. Softer. Warmer. Lily suddenly looked up from the floor. Daddy smiled. Ethan raised an eyebrow. I smile all the time. No, you do not, Lily answered seriously. You mostly make tired faces. Vivian pressed her lips together, trying not to laugh. Ethan pointed toward his daughter. See what I deal with. But there was affection in every word. Vivian watched them together while something unfamiliar settled quietly inside her chest. Peace. Not the expensive kind sold through vacations or luxury penthouses. Something smaller. Safer. That evening snow continued falling outside the apartment windows while Vivian stood awkwardly in Ethan's tiny kitchen attempting to help make dinner. Attempting being the important word. You burned the grilled cheese, Ethan said gently from the stove. Vivian folded her arms immediately. The pan burned the grilled cheese. That is not how cooking works. I run a technology company. And yet you lost a fight with butter. Lily burst into laughter so hard she nearly spilled her apple juice. The sound filled every corner of the apartment. Vivian stared at the little girl for a moment before slowly smiling too. It felt strange using muscles she had not touched in months. Maybe years. Later that night, after Lily fell asleep on the couch beneath a knitted blanket, Ethan quietly carried her to bed while Vivian remained alone in the living room. Snow pressed softly against the windows. The old radiator hissed beside her. For the first time in forever, silence did not feel lonely. Her eyes drifted toward a stack of notebooks near the television stand. One had fallen slightly open. Vivian hesitated before gently picking it up. Handwritten letters filled every page. Not business notes. Not work schedules. Letters. Dear Sarah, Lily lost another tooth today. She says the tooth fairy pays better in Brooklyn than in Queens. Dear Sarah, I think she misses your pancakes more than mine. Dear Sarah, some days I still do not know how to do this without you. Vivian's chest tightened painfully as she turned another page. The handwriting became shakier there. Dear Sarah, I keep pretending I am strong for Lily, but sometimes after she falls asleep, I sit in the truck and wonder if I am failing both of you. Vivian closed the notebook slowly, emotion rising unexpectedly into her throat. You were not supposed to read those. Ethan's voice came softly from behind her. Vivian turned quickly, guilt flashing across her face. I am sorry. Ethan stepped closer, exhaustion resting quietly in his eyes. It is all right. He glanced toward the hallway where Lily slept before lowering his voice. Writing them helps me remember that love does not disappear just because someone is gone. Vivian looked down at the notebook in her hands. I think mine did. Ethan studied her silently for a moment before shaking his head once. No, he said quietly. I do not think someone who sat in a hospital chair for 3 straight nights forgot how to love. The next week passed in a way Vivian Sterling could not explain. Somehow the woman who owned 3 penthouses, 2 private jets, and an office overlooking Central Park found herself spending most evenings inside a 4th-floor apartment that smelled faintly of coffee, laundry, detergent, and pancake syrup. And somehow, it became the only place in New York where she could finally breathe. Snow melted slowly outside, while February sunlight spilled through the kitchen window one quiet Saturday morning. Vivian stood beside the stove wearing one of Ethan's oversized flannel shirts over black leggings because Lily had accidentally dropped orange juice all over Vivian's designer clothes an hour earlier. You look weirdly normal, Ethan said while sipping coffee at the counter. Vivian glanced at him with mock offense. I'm not sure whether that was a compliment. It was definitely confusing. Lily giggled from the table while drawing stars across a paper placemat. Daddy thinks rich people sleep in suits. Ethan pointed toward his daughter. That is not what I said. You said billionaires probably smell expensive all the time. Vivian laughed before she could stop herself. A real laugh this time. Warm enough that Ethan quietly looked away for a second afterward like the sound affected him more than he expected. Vivian noticed. So did Lily. Children always noticed everything. Later that afternoon, Ethan fixed a loose cabinet hinge while Vivian sat cross-legged on the couch helping Lily with homework. Outside, traffic hummed softly through the city while old snow dripped from fire escapes. The apartment felt peaceful in the kind of way money could never manufacture. Miss Vivian? Lily asked quietly while coloring the edge of her worksheet. Vivian looked up immediately. Yeah. Lily hesitated. Do rich people get lonely? Ethan stopped moving in the kitchen. Vivian felt the question settle heavily inside her chest because no one had ever asked her something so simple and so honest before. She glanced toward the window where Manhattan's skyline stretched across the distance like cold silver teeth. Sometimes, she answered softly. Very lonely. Lily tilted her head slightly. Even with all the money? Vivian smiled sadly. Especially with all the money. The little girl seemed to think deeply about that before scooting closer beside Vivian on the couch. Well, our apartment is small, but it is less lonely here. Ethan slowly looked up from the cabinet then. Their eyes met across the room. Something quiet passed between them. Not attraction. Not yet. Something deeper. Recognition, maybe. Two exhausted adults standing on opposite sides of life, suddenly realizing they both understood pain in the same language. That evening, Vivian offered to order dinner from one of Manhattan's most expensive restaurants. Ethan stared at the menu prices in horror. Vivian, this burger costs $38. It has truffle aioli. It still comes from a cow. Lily burst into laughter, so hard milk nearly came out of her nose. Vivian laughed too until tears briefly filled her eyes from the force of it. Ethan watched her carefully then. The woman sitting at his kitchen table looked nothing like the billionaire from television interviews. No cold mask. No polished armor. Just a tired woman finally allowing herself to feel alive again. After dinner, Lily fell asleep with her head resting in Vivian's lap while an old movie played quietly on television. Vivian gently brushed hair away from the little girl's forehead without even realizing she was doing it. Ethan stood near the doorway watching them both in silence. She trusts you, he said softly. Vivian glanced up carefully so she would not wake Lily. I think she just misses having someone around. Ethan shook his head slowly. No, Lily does not open her heart easily anymore. Vivian looked down at the sleeping child against her legs. Something fragile moved painfully inside her chest. Neither do I. Ethan stepped closer, then sat beside her on the couch, close enough that Vivian could feel warmth radiating from him in the quiet apartment. Neither spoke for a long moment. Outside, snow began falling again across the city. Soft, silent, gentle enough to make Manhattan look less lonely for a little while. Then Ethan's old television suddenly flashed breaking news across the screen. Sterling Dynamics, board member under investigation. Vivian's entire body stiffened instantly. Ethan frowned toward the television while the reporter continued speaking. Sources close to billionaire CEO Vivian Sterling claim internal corruption and financial coercion may have links to former executive Marcus Hale. Ethan slowly turned toward Vivian. For the first time since meeting her, realization finally settled into his face. Vivian Sterling, he said quietly. You are the Vivian Sterling? Ethan stared at Vivian as the television continued flashing headlines across the dim apartment. Billionaire CEO. Corporate scandal. Internal investigation. The elegant woman sitting on his couch beside his sleeping daughter suddenly looked very different beneath the cold blue light from the screen. Not because she had changed, but because now the world he knew about her no longer matched the woman who burned grilled cheese sandwiches and laughed at Lily's terrible knock-knock jokes. Vivian slowly looked away first. I was going to tell you. Ethan remained silent for a long moment. Outside, snow tapped softly against the windows while the old radiator hissed through the apartment. You own Sterling Dynamics, he finally said quietly. The company worth billions. Vivian nodded once. Yes. Ethan leaned back against the wall, processing everything slowly. He remembered the night he met her. The expensive gown. The black SUV. The sadness in her eyes that somehow felt bigger than all the wealth surrounding her. So those men that night. Vivian's face darkened slightly. Marcus was trying to pressure me into signing control of the company over to him and his partners. Ethan frowned immediately. Your ex-fiancé? Former fiancé. Her voice carried bitterness now. He spent 3 years convincing me he loved me while secretly positioning himself inside my company. She folded her arms tightly across herself. When I discovered financial manipulation and refused to cooperate, things became ugly very fast. Ethan glanced toward Lily sleeping peacefully on the couch between them. The little girl trusted Vivian completely now. That realization suddenly made him uneasy in a way he could not explain. You should not be here, he said quietly. Vivian looked at him in surprise. What? Ethan stepped toward the television and lowered the volume before speaking again. If people are targeting you, then this apartment is not safe. Something painful crossed Vivian's face. Instantly. Ethan, I mean it. He kept his voice calm, but distance had already begun creeping into it. Lily has already lost one parent. I cannot. He stopped himself there. Vivian slowly stood from the couch. You think I would ever let something happen to her? I think dangerous people follow power. His words were not cruel. Somehow that made them hurt more. Vivian looked down for a moment before quietly reaching for her coat draped over the chair. You are right. Ethan's chest tightened unexpectedly at how small her voice suddenly sounded. Not billionaire small. Human small. Hurt small. Lily stirred awake just as Vivian moved toward the door. Miss Vivian? The sleepy confusion in the little girl's voice froze both adults instantly. Vivian turned back with a soft smile she clearly did not feel. Hey, sweetheart. Lily rubbed her eyes. Are you leaving? Silence filled the apartment. Ethan looked away first. Vivian crouched beside the couch and gently brushed hair away from Lily's forehead. Just for tonight. Lily frowned immediately. But Saturday is movie night. Vivian swallowed hard before forcing another smile. I know. Did Daddy say something dumb again? Ethan let out a quiet breath from across the room. Thanks, kid. Lily sat up straighter beneath the blanket and reached for Vivian's hand. You always look sad before you go home. Vivian felt her throat tighten instantly. Lily, you smile more here. The little girl said it so simply. Like truth should always be simple. Vivian blinked quickly before kissing the top of Lily's head. Good night, sweetheart. Then she stood and walked toward the door before her emotions could betray her completely. Ethan followed her into the hallway outside the apartment. Cold air drifted through the old building, while distant sirens echoed somewhere downtown. Vivian stared at the floor for a moment before speaking softly. I forgot what it felt like to sit at a dinner table with people who actually cared whether I ate. Ethan's jaw tightened slightly. Vivian, no one waits for me at home. Her eyes finally lifted toward his. Vulnerable. Honest. Do you know how terrifying that becomes after a while? Ethan looked at her silently because the truth was he did understand. More than she realized. Vivian slowly slipped her hands into the pockets of Ethan's oversized flannel shirt she still wore beneath her coat. I should return this. Ethan shook his head faintly. Keep it. Their eyes met for one quiet second too long. Something dangerous lived there now. Not danger like Marcus or the men in black SUVs. Something softer. More frightening. The possibility of needing someone again. Vivian gave a tiny nod before stepping backward toward the elevator. Good night, Ethan. Good night, Vivian. The elevator doors closed between them moments later. Ethan remained standing in the hallway long after she disappeared because somehow the apartment already felt colder without her inside it. For the next 4 days, Ethan kept expecting Vivian to return. Every sound in the hallway made him glance toward the apartment door before realizing it was only neighbors coming home from work or kids running upstairs. He told himself the quiet should feel normal again. Easier even. But it did not. The apartment felt strangely hollow now, like warmth had briefly visited and then disappeared without warning. Lily noticed first. You keep checking your phone, she said one evening while eating macaroni at the kitchen counter. Ethan frowned immediately. No, I do not. You checked it 6 times during one commercial. Ethan opened his mouth to argue before giving up with a tired sigh. Finish your dinner, detective. Lily narrowed her eyes suspiciously. You miss her. Ethan stared down into his coffee for a moment. The truth sat heavily in his chest because he did miss her. He missed the way she looked genuinely amazed every time ordinary life surprised her. He missed hearing her laugh from the kitchen. He even missed the expensive perfume that lingered faintly on his couch cushions after she left. But more than anything, he missed the feeling that someone finally understood how exhausting loneliness could become. Across Manhattan, Vivian stood alone inside her penthouse staring out at the city lights through 30-foot windows. Everything looked beautiful from up there. Elegant. Untouchable. Empty. Her dining table could seat 16 people, yet held nothing except unopened mail and silence. The polished marble floors echoed beneath her heels as she walked through rooms too large for one person to live in comfortably. She had once believed success would protect her from pain. Instead, it had only isolated her inside it. Her assistant, Claire, entered cautiously carrying a tablet. The board meeting starts in 20 minutes. Vivian did not move from the window. Cancel it. Claire blinked in surprise. Vivian, the investors are all ready. I said cancel it. The sharpness in her voice faded almost immediately afterward. Vivian closed her eyes briefly before speaking softer. Please. Claire studied her boss carefully. You have not slept again, have you? Vivian gave a humorless smile. I slept for 3 hours yesterday. That feels productive. Claire hesitated before carefully placing the tablet aside. You know, before all this happened, you used to talk about growth forecasts like they were poetry. Vivian let out a faint laugh under her breath. That sounds unbearable. No, Claire said gently. It sounded like someone who still believed life had meaning. Silence settled between them. Vivian looked back toward the skyline again before quietly asking, have you ever sat in a room so quiet that it actually hurts? Claire's expression softened immediately because suddenly this was not a billionaire speaking. Just a tired woman unraveling slowly beneath the weight of being alone too long. Meanwhile, downtown, Ethan tucked Lily into bed while snow fell softly outside her bedroom window. The little girl held her stuffed rabbit close beneath the blankets. Daddy. Yes, sweetheart. Do you think Miss Vivian is lonely tonight? Ethan paused while pulling the blanket higher around her shoulders. Probably. Lily looked thoughtful for a moment. Then you should call her. Ethan smiled faintly. Life is not always that simple. Why not? Ethan had no answer for that. After Lily fell asleep, he sat alone at the kitchen table staring at his phone while cold coffee rested untouched beside him. He knew getting involved with someone like Vivian could bring danger into their lives. Complicated, dangerous things. But another thought kept haunting him too. What if walking away hurt them anyway? His phone suddenly buzzed against the table. Unknown number. Ethan frowned before answering carefully. Hello. Static crackled softly for a second before a familiar voice whispered through the line. Ethan. He stood immediately at the sound of Vivian's voice. Something was wrong. Vivian. Her breathing sounded uneven. Frightened. I did not know who else to call. Ethan's entire expression changed instantly. What happened? Silence. Then very quietly, almost like she was ashamed to admit it, Vivian whispered, I think someone is inside my apartment. Ethan grabbed his truck keys so fast the chair nearly tipped backward behind him. Vivian, listen to me carefully, he said, forcing calm into his voice while pulling on his jacket. Are you locked inside your bedroom? Her breathing shook softly through the phone. Yes. Good. Stay there. Call building security right now. Silence lingered for half a second too long. I already tried. Ethan's stomach tightened instantly. And nobody answered. Manhattan blurred past his windshield 20 minutes later beneath streaks of freezing rain, while Ethan gripped the steering wheel hard enough for his knuckles to pale. Every red light felt unbearable. Every second stretched too long. He had tucked Lily safely into bed at their neighbor, Mrs. Hernandez's apartment before leaving, but guilt still sat heavy in his chest. Because deep down he already knew this was bigger than corporate drama now. Someone was trying to break Vivian emotionally before they destroyed her professionally. When Ethan finally reached the towering glass building overlooking Central Park, 2 police cruisers already sat outside beneath flashing lights. He rushed through the lobby, ignoring the confused concierge calling after him. The penthouse doors upstairs stood open when he arrived. Cold air drifted through the massive apartment, while security officers moved quietly through the marble halls. Vivian stood near the kitchen island wrapped in a blanket despite the heat blasting through the room. The moment she saw Ethan, something inside her visibly unraveled. She crossed the room quickly and threw her arms around him before either of them could think about it. Ethan caught her instantly. Hey, he whispered softly. You are okay. Vivian's hands trembled slightly against the back of his jacket. I thought someone was still here. Ethan held her a little tighter without realizing it. The apartment around them looked untouched at first glance. Perfect white marble. Expensive artwork. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking millions of lights below. Yet somehow the place felt violated anyway. Unsafe. One of the officers approached carefully. Mr. Cole. Ethan nodded. There was no sign of forced entry, the officer explained. But whoever came in definitely wanted to send a message. He handed Ethan a photograph sealed inside an evidence bag. Ethan's jaw tightened instantly when he saw it. A framed family picture from Ethan's apartment. Lily smiling between him and Sarah at Coney Island years ago. Vivian noticed the change in Ethan's expression immediately. What is it? Ethan slowly turned the photo toward her. Vivian's face drained of color. Written across the glass in black marker were 4 simple words. You cannot protect them. Silence swallowed the room after that. Ethan looked toward the officer again. How did they get this? It was left on Miss Sterling's bed. Vivian wrapped the blanket tighter around herself, as if suddenly freezing. Marcus, she whispered. Ethan turned sharply toward her. You know that for sure? Vivian nodded slowly, eyes distant now. That was his favorite tactic. Fear first, then pressure. She walked toward the massive windows overlooking Manhattan before speaking again. He wants me exhausted, isolated, easier to control. Ethan stared at the message on the shattered photograph, while anger quietly built beneath his ribs. Not because someone threatened him, because they threatened Lily. Behind him, Vivian's voice softened almost to a whisper. I am sorry. Ethan looked back at her immediately. For what? Her eyes glistened beneath the city lights. For bringing this into your life. Ethan crossed the room slowly until he stood beside her. Near the windows, snow drifted across Manhattan far below them like tiny pieces of ash falling through darkness. You did not bring this into my life, he said quietly. Bad people did. Vivian shook her head faintly. You should stay away from me. Ethan let out a humorless laugh under his breath. You know what is funny? Vivian looked up at him carefully. The night we met, I thought you looked like someone who stopped wanting to live. His voice stayed calm. Honest. Now I think you are just someone who has been fighting alone too long. Vivian's eyes filled instantly at those words because nobody had ever described her life so accurately before. Ethan glanced around the enormous penthouse once more. Expensive, beautiful, empty. Then he looked back at Vivian standing there wrapped in fear and exhaustion despite all the wealth surrounding her. Pack a bag, he said finally. Vivian blinked in confusion. What? You are not staying here tonight. Ethan, I mean it. His tone softened slightly. Nobody should be alone after something like this. Vivian stared at him silently. You would really bring me back to your apartment after all this? Ethan thought about Lily asleep downtown. About pancake mornings. About laughter returning to rooms that had forgotten how to hold it. Then he looked at Vivian and answered honestly. That stopped feeling like just my apartment a while ago. By the following evening, Vivian's expensive luggage sat awkwardly beside Ethan's faded couch, while Lily treated the situation like Christmas morning. This is officially the coolest sleepover ever, she announced proudly while dragging extra blankets across the apartment. Ethan leaned against the kitchen counter watching Vivian attempt to fit designer clothes into one empty dresser drawer beside Lily's coloring books and mismatched socks. You really did not have to bring half your closet, he said. Vivian glanced over her shoulder. I packed one suitcase. Ethan raised an eyebrow. That suitcase costs more than my truck. Lily gasped dramatically from the hallway. Daddy, do not insult rich people luggage. Vivian laughed quietly before something in her expression softened. She had not realized how badly she needed this. Noise, warmth, human life filling empty spaces. Even the tiny apartment felt safer than the penthouse guarded by cameras and private security. Because here, people looked at her like a person instead of a corporation. Later that night, snow covered the city in silence while Ethan spread blankets across the couch for Vivian. You can take the bedroom, she offered softly. I already stole your apartment. Ethan shook his head immediately. Not happening. Ethan, Vivian, I survived years sleeping in a pickup truck after Sarah died. His voice stayed calm, matter of fact. I think I can survive one couch. Vivian looked at him carefully then. There it was again. That quiet strength she trusted more every day. Not loud strength. Not billionaire strength. Real strength. The kind built through grief and sacrifice instead of power. Thank you, she whispered. Ethan gave a small nod before turning off the kitchen light. Good night, Vivian. Good night, Ethan. But sleep never really came. Around 2 in the morning, Vivian sat alone by the apartment window wrapped in Ethan's flannel shirt while snow drifted beneath the streetlights outside. The city looked softer tonight somehow. Less cruel. She heard quiet footsteps behind her moments later. Ethan appeared carrying 2 mugs of tea. You were not sleeping either? She asked softly. Ethan handed her one of the mugs before sitting beside her near the window. Firefighters learn to live without sleep. Vivian stared down into the steam rising from her tea. And billionaires learn to pretend they are fine. Ethan looked toward her carefully. You do not have to pretend here. The simplicity of those words nearly broke something inside her. Vivian swallowed hard before speaking again. When my father died, everyone told me to stay strong because the company needed me. Her voice sounded distant now, like she was remembering a version of herself she barely recognized. Then Marcus came along and convinced me that love could survive inside a world built on money and ambition. She laughed softly without humor. Turns out I was just useful. Ethan remained quiet beside her. Not interrupting, not trying to fix it, just listening. Somehow that mattered more. Vivian finally looked up at him. Do you know what scared me most after the attack? Ethan frowned slightly. What? Not dying. Her fingers tightened around the warm mug. The thought that nobody would actually miss me as a person. They would miss the CEO, the headlines, the money, but not me. Ethan's expression shifted instantly at those words. That is not true. Vivian smiled sadly. You barely know me. Ethan looked toward the sleeping hallway where Lily rested before answering quietly. I know you sat beside my hospital bed for 3 nights when you could have hired 100 nurses instead. His eyes met hers fully then. I know my daughter smiles differently when you are around. Vivian felt tears burn suddenly behind her eyes. Ethan continued softly. And I know you keep pretending you are harder than you really are, because somewhere along the way, people convinced you softness was weakness. Silence settled between them again. Heavy, intimate in a way neither expected. Vivian looked down quickly, overwhelmed by how seen she suddenly felt. Then Ethan reached into the pocket of his sweatpants and carefully pulled something folded from years of carrying it around. One of Sarah's old handwritten notes. He placed it gently into Vivian's hands. She unfolded it slowly beneath the dim apartment light. Ethan, if life ever gives you another chance at happiness, please do not run from it just because you loved me first. Vivian stared at the words while emotion tightened painfully in her chest. Sarah wrote this? Ethan nodded faintly. A month before she passed away. Vivian looked up at him through tears she no longer tried to hide. And have you been happy since then? Ethan studied her quietly for a long moment before answering with complete honesty. Not until recently. Spring arrived slowly in Manhattan after the longest winter Vivian Sterling could remember. The snow disappeared from sidewalks. Trees began blooming again in small, stubborn bursts of color across the city. And somehow, little by little, life began returning to people who thought parts of themselves were gone. Forever. 3 months after the night Vivian moved into Ethan's apartment, the federal investigation into Marcus Hale became public. Financial crimes, corporate coercion, multiple illegal shell accounts hidden beneath fake partnerships. News stations covered the scandal for weeks, while Marcus disappeared from every boardroom and charity gala he once controlled. But for Vivian, the headlines mattered less than she expected. Because for the first time in years, her life no longer revolved around surviving public opinion. One Sunday afternoon, Ethan stood beneath warm sunlight outside a small community center in Brooklyn while children chased bubbles across the sidewalk nearby. Sterling Foundation banners hung above folding tables covered with free meals and donated school supplies. Vivian moved through the crowd laughing softly as Lily dragged her toward an arts and crafts booth, with blue paint already smeared across her cheeks. Miss Vivian, hurry. I am trying. No, rich people walk too slow. Ethan shook his head while watching them disappear toward the sidewalk tables. Beside him, Claire smiled knowingly. You realize she has not smiled like this in years. Ethan looked toward Vivian again. Wind lifted strands of golden hair across her face, while Lily wrapped both tiny arms around her waist. The image hit him unexpectedly hard because suddenly it felt impossible to remember life before her. Yeah, he answered quietly. I think she forgot she was allowed to be happy. Claire studied him carefully for a moment before walking away to help volunteers near the food trucks. Ethan remained where he was beneath the warm afternoon sun, while emotion settled heavily in his chest. Not fear anymore. Not loneliness either. Something steadier. Home maybe. A few minutes later, Vivian approached carrying 2 paper cups of lemonade. Your daughter just challenged 3 fourth graders to a sidewalk chalk competition. Ethan accepted one of the drinks with a laugh. That sounds accurate. Vivian stood beside him quietly watching Lily in the distance. I used to think people admired power, she admitted softly. Now I think most people are just searching for somewhere safe to put their heart. Ethan looked at her carefully. Did you find that? Vivian turned toward him slowly. I found a tiny apartment in Brooklyn where people argued about pancakes and left socks everywhere. Ethan smiled faintly. Sounds terrible. It saved my life. The honesty in her voice nearly took his breath away. Around them, children laughed beneath spring sunlight, while music drifted softly through the crowded street fair. Simple things. Ordinary things. Yet somehow they felt more valuable than every luxury Vivian once surrounded herself with. Lily suddenly ran toward them, holding a piece of folded construction paper. Daddy. Ethan crouched slightly. What is it, sweetheart? Lily grinned proudly before handing him the paper ring she made with glitter and blue marker hearts. I made you a practice engagement ring because real ones are expensive. Vivian nearly choked on her lemonade while Ethan burst into helpless laughter. Practice engagement ring? Lily nodded seriously. In case you get nervous. Ethan looked down at the paper ring in his hand before slowly glancing toward Vivian, whose cheeks had turned pink beneath the afternoon sunlight. Well, Ethan said carefully, that is definitely one way to avoid pressure. Lily folded her arms impatiently. Daddy. Ethan exhaled softly before standing fully upright again. Then, in the middle of the crowded Brooklyn sidewalk surrounded by children, volunteers, chalk drawings, and spring sunlight, he reached into his jacket pocket. Vivian's breath caught instantly. Ethan pulled out Sarah's handwritten note, now carefully folded beside a small velvet box. I carried this for years because I thought loving someone again would somehow mean I loved Sarah less. His voice stayed calm, but emotional, honest in the way only Ethan ever was. But then you walked into my life wearing a silver dress and looking like the loneliest person in New York. Tears filled Vivian's eyes before he even opened the ring box. Ethan stepped closer. You gave Lily laughter again. His voice softened. You gave me peace again. Then he looked directly into her eyes and whispered the words Vivian once believed nobody would ever say to her. Sincerely, come home with us for good. Vivian covered her mouth as tears slipped freely down her cheeks. Around them, the world seemed to disappear for one perfect second. No billion-dollar company. No headlines. No loneliness. Just love standing quietly in the middle of an ordinary Brooklyn street. Lily bounced excitedly beside them. Say yes. Daddy cries less when you are here. Vivian laughed through tears before nodding immediately. Yes. Ethan slipped the ring gently onto her hand while sunlight poured across the street, like something warm finally returning after a very long winter.